Welcome to the Ideal Spaces Working Group podcast.
Hello, good evening. I want to welcome you to our podcast with Jason Montgomery about the public square. We are Ulrich Gehmann and Grant Rainham from the Ideal Spaces Foundation performing this podcast with Jason. Jason, please start.
Thank you both for having me. It's an honor to be joining Ideal Spaces podcast. And today I would love to jump into a conversation about the public square. And I thought that the kind of title I would give this would be Reappraising the Public Square, Exploration of the Urban Form and Life in the American City. And just to emphasize, the way I'm approaching this is from American urban form questions, and obviously other parts of the world, have other types of conditions, and so this is really meant to apply to the challenges in the American city. So, if I may, I could read the abstract to kind of describe the overview of the conversation we could have. So the public realm of the American city in the 21st century is generally an ambiguous territory that only fitfully rises to its potential to support human flourishing. The post-COVID shakeup of the status quo, especially in regard to the impacts of Euclidean zoning and the demise of the aging commercial downtown, offers an opportunity for transformation of the public realm of the city. Its streets, boulevards, alleys, squares, and parks. Reflections on cultural, social, and political currents in this moment likely are driving a sense that we need to search for a better form of daily life, an internal longing for both belonging and meaning. This longing has persisted throughout the domination of neoliberal policies that failed to deliver the full spectrum of support and benefit that individuals and communities need to flourish. Social connection can be seen as a key to the restart of a process that more broadly and deeply addresses the longing and anxiety of our time. We can turn to daily patterns of commuting, working, going to work, shopping, childcare as an opportunity space for fostering new social connections, especially in urban centers and urban neighborhoods. The built environment is formed by planning efforts and intentions, but despite seeming obvious, social connection is rarely emphasized in planning efforts. Instead, it has so often been a lower priority, with cars and traffic dominating the design of the public realm, and thereby this spatial allocation of city open space. Architects played a role in the 20th century, conceiving of new concepts for cities that intentionally or not undermine social connection in general city space. Venturi's well-cited view that Americans do not want piazze, do not appreciate a culture of public space and social life in the city, needs examination through contextualization. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy when Euclidean zoning, the reduction of public transit capacity, especially streetcars, and anti-street architecture, white flight, and redlining was wiping out the conditions in the quality of the public realm that would encourage social life in city space. A dedication to the reversal of the major forces that drove Americans away from urban life can build a foundation for this restart, a new public realm approach that prioritizes the potential and opportunities for social connection. In regard to the built fabric that forms the public realm, deduced principles of urban form, lived experience, and case studies and data can help drive the design process to respond to human nature in the making of public space to facilitate potential social interaction and connection.
This is a very important start and outline of many different aspects and important aspects as regards the relation between the human being as a social animal and its surrounding architecture. As regards the radiating benefits of squares in urban neighborhoods, in American cities in particular, in your eyes, which are the most important points here to be considered?
So I think the American city's lack of public space for social interaction in the most casual way and even the most formal way, we have as a starting point the idea of the radiating influences that the public space can have. It needs to start at the most basic level, and each of these ideas of radiating circles of kind of meaningfulness or importance, it really, like, if you achieve at the beginning the most central ones, then the other ones might occur over time. But even if you only achieve the say the base level, you're already doing something that's not being done currently in the American city. So at the core, for example, I suggest that a public square, especially at a neighborhood scale, I think it's important to think, okay, we have spaces that are important civic level, but we also can have spaces at the basic urban neighborhood level where people are spending, many trips in their daily life, moving about as a pedestrian. The first goal of a public square in that context, I believe, is a place of rest. Being in the city in a different way than being on the street. Certainly, I've been a New Yorker since 1999, the great city that certainly where Jane Jacobs also formulated all of her, some of the most important reflections on city life. An ecosystem like New York, while still being the most rich, major city in the United States, you need something that contrasts with street life. Street life, is a place of movement. It's a place of busyness. It might foster certain casual kind of events, but, we need an alternative type of way of being in the city. And this is something Jan Gehl also talks about. We can be in the city, we can be moving through the city, but in a mobile way, but we also need opportunities to stay in the city, be in a place and come to rest. So if that's the base condition for a public square in the city, then the next layer above that is while you're in that place and in a place at rest, you have the ability to obviously see and be seen, to have the most basic level of social interaction, which is, can be a purely passive experience, but we can watch the life happening in the space around us. We can see people entering and leaving the square. We can see other people coming in also to rest. And we have that most basic idea of us. We are social creatures and we are able to observe other people. And of course, we know that we're also out in that public realm and other people can observe us. Then, we could, because of that level of social interaction, we might feel connected in a way that we wouldn't otherwise. So in essence, the next level, I think, is the sense that we belong in that space with other people, that we feel the connection with the people that we're observing, and that we know that they're seeing us, and we know that they might feel connected with us. Those are both passive activities. So if nothing else, urban space in an American city can do something that might be common in other parts of the world, but is really almost a rare urban experience in the American cities. The next layer becomes then active. So we could start to have either casual connections with other people. We might smile and make contact. We might start up a conversation. We might compliment somebody, like dog walkers in New York actually are the one example where there's something connecting people. So the idea that you might have a short conversation with somebody. So now that next layer is an active social connection that can start to build. Over time, if this kind of activity is happening in a public square in an American urban neighborhood, you're building then a possibility for a sense of meaningfulness connected to that place. We can recognize that we feel good when we spend a day in the square and we've had those social connections. Certainly, having lived through COVID in a city like New York, and certainly this was true for many cities around the world. We cherished that. We appreciated and cherished the most basic type of human interaction. So the idea that we can, through passive social connection and active social connections, we start to see the meaningfulness of all this in our lives. And I do think when we look at our current moment in history, the loneliness epidemic, the mental health epidemic, the sense of stress that I think a lot of, especially in the United States, that Americans are feeling, is related to the fact that we don't have time or place to just feel the wonderful meaningfulness of being together, in the life that we're all, dealing with at this point. That we want the sense of camaraderie, we want the sense of connection to other people. So so once meaningfulness starts to creep in, I think the idea of place really begins to flourish. So the idea that instead of just thinking of a square as a spatial condition, now I think it takes on a place quality, a placeness. And it also might begin to feel, for example, as a center of the neighborhood, a place that you think of instantly when you say, well, when I identify with my neighborhood, I think of this place in the neighborhood as its center or its identifying feature. As that continues to grow, then memories over time start to form related to that space. So if I brought my kids there when they were very young, and now they're teenagers or young adults, they obviously can go back to that place and feel the memory of growing up in this urban neighborhood around this place. And so really then, as you build towards the ultimate, potential of the place, that place, because it becomes meaningful, because there are memories embedded in the place, that's where special events would naturally occur. That's where gatherings would happen. That's where, when people wanted to commemorate something, or they wanted to celebrate something, or they wanted to mourn, or they wanted to organize politically or to protest, this would be a natural place for all that to happen. So I think that's the potential that public squares and urban neighborhoods could have. They don't need to always achieve all those layers, and certainly those layers might happen only over long periods of times in multi-generational conditions. Yeah. But at the very least, we could start at the beginning, where creating both moments for passive social connection and maybe active social connection is a step forward rather than remaining in the condition we're in now.
In the major cities in the United States, I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, and I lived in New York also, by the way. And I think my point to ask you is, we saw COVID or Corona, whichever you want to call it, and we saw that people were withdrawn from the city centers. They were working from home, so forth and so on, which in a lot of cases had to be. And what we've seen, or what we're seeing, or what we're hearing is, like in the city centers of like San Francisco, Los Angeles, maybe not New York as much, but maybe in those cities, the centers have been evacuated from businesses, from the high rises that are around the squares or the city centers or the parks. There's nobody there. So basically, how do you see the reconstruction of using these buildings around the square to enhance, like, I guess we could call it a collective consciousness of people to get to the square and talk to one another, for instance,
Well, certainly that's where I think the coronavirus the pandemic opened the door to potential. We know that commercial centers, including Midtown Manhattan, which is the most major concentration of commercial in the United States, that has been a suffering, suffered since the pandemic, and has been emptied out and still remains to this day a challenged part of the city life. The current response to the demise, and I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Pittsburgh, has a city with a lot of great features. I grew up in the suburbs outside of the city center. The city center, for sure, for me, was the classic American downtown experience, meaning you never expected anyone to live there at all. You never, on a weekend, you would imagine that there would be streets, and there quite often were streets that were totally empty of people.
Right.
And so the idea of the commercial downtown is like a dinosaur that the pandemic helped us recognize is not a it's not a good strategy for city making. So the idea that commercial centers today, you might see that these office towers get converted into use. Certainly, there's a huge challenge to say take a 1960s office tower in Midtown Manhattan and suddenly transform it into residential construction. It's actually very technically difficult, and it may not, but it works in some buildings better than others. But the general appreciation, I think, that all city leaders have around the United States is we cannot afford to leave parts of our city zoned and occupied only for one use, such as commercial use. We need the mixture of uses, which of course Jane Jacobs was a major prophet of that, and the importance of that to American cities. Needs to be the norm. We need to go into these downtown commercial zones, and we need to do everything we can to make them viable places as new urban neighborhoods with housing brought in, with that to support, say, the small businesses that are now almost shut down because if the office workers are not there, those businesses are not able to survive. So we need to recalibrate how these urban centers work. Interestingly, lower Manhattan, as another case study, is filled with pre-war tower buildings that actually lend themselves much better to residential conversion. And that process had already been going on for quite a long time, but long before the pandemic. And so lower Manhattan already had a building residential community that was, starting, not completing the process of transformation, so that you had liveliness all times a day. You had services that were related to residents as well as the business people who would be down there around the stock market and all the high-rise office towers. So I think the mixture of uses, the end of mono-functional zones of cities like that is going to be helping us reclaim that space. At the same time, I think, things like once the commuting patterns and the use patterns are changing, there's an opportunity to remake the open space in these neighborhoods and reclaim territory for being in the city. And here's just to point out in this context, this is where the neoliberal aspect needs to be addressed, because the public spaces we do find often in these commercial cores are the forecourt of an office tower. And that's not our ideal form of public space. Very often it's not truly public space, it's privately owned public space. It's identified with the identity of the corporate office tower itself. The public space that we need is space that isn't overly dominated or in any way dominated by private interests. It has to be space that has the true public character that we need. So that's something that I think the pandemic opened the door. Certainly we saw this during the pandemic, shutting down streets, letting more stuff happen on the sidewalk. And we saw the data that I referred to in the abstract. We saw people using those spaces, with eagerness. It's almost like a breath of fresh air. Finally, we get to say, go out in our neighborhood, and we can sit on the floor of the pavement that's usually space for cars, and we can make use of that for family activities, for sunbathing, for an evening dinner outside, whatever it might be, and we can be surrounded by our neighbors, and we're enjoying that space together. I think that potential could come into these city cores in a new and kind of much more significant way than we've been allowed. Just to point out, New York has already backtracked on that. We've lost many of those streets that got closed during the pandemic for that kind of activity. The ones that remain are under severe pressure to operate because they're usually not financially supported or guaranteed by the city. And we've lost even our sidewalk cafes across New York that were a major opportunity for people like to be out in the streets together in a much more significant way than they were before the pandemic. And now we're kind of right back into that condition with the elimination of all the sidewalk sheds. We've lost that vitality of the street that we had, post-pandemic, that we all enjoyed quite a bit.
Well, these are interesting aspects also in the direction of how to make it concrete. Also, it is about, in fact, the transformation of a city. And could you outline, based on your findings and experiences, could you outline what framework conditions would have to be installed to achieve this viable city again, open for the citizens, as you described it?
Well, certainly the most current thing that we can consider is efforts like congestion pricing, which is something also New York is embarked upon since January. We need to, Jane Jacobs said very clearly, you're either expanding the capacity of the car in the city or you're reducing it. There is no stasis. There's no way to find a perfect happy medium. And the demands of traffic and cars is always growing. So if you just let free use of city centers for car traffic, they will be the dominant feature, and they will, as Jan Gehl says, cars are a direct conflict with the ability of pedestrians to engage in their city, engage in city life. So congestion pricing in New York is an experiment that can be obviously following Stockholm and London, that is significantly already, since just over a month of operation, has reduced the number of cars in the city enough that people are feeling the effects of it. You feel the calmer morning commute. Even in, say, the neighborhood where I live, which is outside the congestion zone, you can noticeably feel the less, the decreased traffic numbers on the streets around you, which makes for a calmer city condition. So reducing, road diets, congestion pricing, literally, and our first framework, right, is generally trying to get traffic down and moving people from private cars into public transit, into other forms of mobility, e-bikes, all sorts of different biking, into shared, even still shared car service, but when it's shared, and that will, reframe life more about pedestrian accessibility and mobility. Other things you can do will be, for example, reducing, even when you leave traffic lanes throughout the city, you reduce their traffic lane dimensions. Johns Hopkins did a study that they published about a year ago that's demonstrated that when traffic lanes in cities are 9 to 10 feet wide, as opposed to the more standard 11 to 12 feet wide, you slow down traffic, you reduce accidents and fatalities, and you make a much more civilized condition for pedestrians. So there's infrastructural changes that you can make that will take the first major aspect that opens the door to this kind of public space in cities, which is you really address the fact that over time, if you study cities like New York, you can almost literally measure, how the road bed has grown over time, reducing pedestrian space to the bare minimum. We need the reversal of that, where the generosity of space for pedestrians is overwhelming, so that the invitation to be in the public realm is very clear. Barcelona, of course, is doing this. We're talking about the American city, but we can look to other cities around the world for their infrastructural changes. Barcelona, also having faced a major issue of congestion, pollution, danger to pedestrians, has gone through this super block transformation, which is essentially making pedestrians first-class citizens in their neighborhoods. They're controlling the space around them. And when cars are allowed in, service vehicles and other types of vehicles, they have to respect that they're in a pedestrian environment. So that kind of flip of making the pedestrian the first-class citizen in the city, and the car has to accommodate around the pedestrian. That's the type of framework and infrastructural change that we need to see.
Mhm. Okay. As regards public transport, there are two aspects coming into my mind, more or less out of a sudden. One aspect is public transport, at least as we know it from many Western European countries. The possibilities for public transport are very often, not always, but very often poor, in particular at certain times of the day or in the night. Related is the problem of crime. Many people are just simply afraid to go after 10 o'clock in the evening into a tube, in the metro. They do not access it due to fear of crime. How to deal with these issues?
Yes, certainly. I've always said that one way to judge American cities across the board is just look at the buses and who's riding on the bus.
Mm-hmm.
I think the majority of American cities, you really see strong demographic segregation on buses, right? So it's a small part of the community that it doesn't have access to a private car, or it's too expensive to be driving on a daily basis, so they're riding the bus. Whereas the more affluent population is in their private vehicle in their commute. So certainly public transport is fundamental to the vibrancy of a city, and a city that is making space for public squares and public gathering in city space. We need transport to be safe, we need it to be clean, and we need it to be frequent. I think transport suffers when the population densities are just not there to support it. When you have just not enough people riding on a line or at that time of day, you will have the low numbers, and you will have, with low numbers come more threat. Certainly crime is usually happening on public transport, as you say, in the evening when the numbers are much smaller. So building public transport around in combination with population density is important. I'm right now in Washington, D.C. at Catholic University, and across the street we have a Washington Metro stop. But the university is on the kind of outskirts of the city center, and around the stop the Metro stop is a parking lot that's for buses, people to transfer from the Metro to the bus to go off to further neighborhoods. That's kind of a wasteland of space right now. And actually, we did have some crime in that space recently that raised everyone's awareness that something's got to change. The Washington Metro Authority has a plan to convert spaces like that into new mixed-use, dense neighborhoods of new housing on the land that they control, that would be built literally on the doorstep of the Metro entrance, as well as the place where all the where people can transfer between bus mobility and the Metro. And they want to pump hundreds of new units into that empty space to encourage new ridership in all the public transit, to bring an active population immediately adjacent to the transit hub, so that it's not a wasteland, it's not empty at night. It's actually people are sitting out in a restaurant in the square right by the Metro entrance, rather than it being a no man's land at that point. So the idea of linking new population densities to transit opportunities, so that you have that kind of win-win. You have more people where the transit is, and you have more ridership for the transit, and more ridership, maybe even 24/7. They're encouraging signs. Like I'm commuting back and forth between Washington and New York. I'm taking the Amtrak commuter train, and then I'm transferring to the subway in New York City. And I sometimes will be arriving in around Penn Station at midnight on almost any given night. And what I'm always amazed by are the crowds of people out, that are doing their stuff in the city even late at night. So, a city that does have a nightlife, that has people moving about. I lived in London for 4 years, and the metro there, the tube there would shut down at 11, so you maybe have to ride a bus instead of on the tube. But the idea of more population density connected to the transit is definitely a positive. I think crime in general in urban areas is requires urban culture. So the whole conversation about public space is not just about a kind of amenity to enjoy. It's also that, as we get to see each other and feel each other's humanity, that the connections that we feel, either passive or active, are only going to move us in the right direction. At least they're not going to solve crime, but it's certainly crime is addressed when people feel less lonely, when people are, mental health is addressed because of human contact and these other things. So I think they're connected issues, and transit is super important. And the positive feedback loop, for example, that New York is trying to accomplish right now, congestion pricing is paying all the revenue generated by congestion pricing is being fed back into the public transit system. Make it cleaner, provide more salaries for security on the subway, provide higher visibility of public transit, increase the frequency, which makes it so convenient that you don't want to choose any other method of moving around the city. We need to make these virtuous cycles that then come back to making public space of the city more available to spatial conditions like the public square, as opposed to a small sidewalk dominated by car traffic.
Yeah. This relates to the question of a common consciousness again as regards urbanity. Are we the citizens capable and to really imagine another kind of city life in the direction of an urbanity deserving the name, with the human contact you outlined, and with this feeling. It's about the atmosphere. A public space has a certain atmosphere which is encouraging in itself. For instance,
exactly, I think
the Italian Piazza, so this is a different life.
Yeah, I think, while say, and the Venturi quote is where I often hear the most resistance to this concept that, Americans, Venturi says this in the appendix to Complexity and Contradiction, and he's referring to the square in Boston where he's proposing a project. And he's really saying, well, our design for this square is really about people, Copley Square, it's really about people moving, because Americans really just want to get back home to their TVs and their TV dinners, in their suburban houses. So again, I think that's a highly problematic statement to make at the time where cities were being destroyed and abandoned to the only people that could remain in the city, which were, minority populations that were being redlined and restricted from actually leaving for the suburbs. My evidence in the American city is that when public space is made available, people gobble it up, and I think the pandemic, of course, was the great experiment of that. I do, New York has made strides in this regard. And again, I'm very New York centric. And so, Los Angeles, obviously has its own challenges. I know Pittsburgh well, I know Chicago to some degree. My experience is that when you say have festivals, when you shut down streets, you give people the opportunity to be out in the city in this way that I'm describing, of just being in the city and resting in city space. We see it all the time. Americans are doing it, right, when they're given that opportunity, and they have a sense of pleasure that they're seeing the city in a new way. An example of that is the city's Summer Streets program in New York City, where In one particular case this past summer, New York shut down from Harlem. They shut down a route of city streets that would take you from Harlem all the way across the bridge into Brooklyn. So they made this major spine of space available just on the weekends with police shutting down the cross streets to protect against traffic. They set up this incredible 10-mile, 12-mile long distance of pedestrian available space, or shut down non-car space, and immediately it fills up. You have people running, you have people biking, you have people walking their dog. They set up little stations along the way for city agencies to like have outreach and things of that sort. People were gathering around those sites, and you saw what I'd like to say anecdotally is you saw a smile on almost everyone's face, including the police officers watching the life go by. You saw the transformation that giving people, as not in cars, could be on bikes, could be walk on foot, but not in cars, enjoying this incredible sequence of space available to them, not only because it was fun and you could have a new experience, but I think it was also that you were literally in the middle of the street, enjoying the perspective of, say, seeing the buildings and the history of New York architecture around you in a way that you don't have available on a regular basis. So I think that literal change of perspective, and also being the king of that space, or the first-class citizen in that space, because now it was for you as a pedestrian. It was not the taxi and the car and the bus and all the other vehicles in that space. I think there is the social, I'm faithful in the social inclination of all cultures around the world. And that's, I've traveled to West Africa and North Africa. I've traveled to Central America, everywhere I've been. I was in Grenada recently for a project. It's human nature to be out in city space, to set up chairs and just watch people life go by. I don't think there's any cultural barrier to this type of activity. I think what we see in the American city, and this is where my research is often pointed, like I've done these studies back to the early urbanization of especially Manhattan, Brooklyn, and a little bit in Detroit. And what I saw in, say, the 19th century, late 18th century ideas of how cities should be how we would convert farmland into city space. The documentation shows that people were thinking about public squares. The public was asking for public squares. In Brooklyn in particular, where we have the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a wonderful newspaper that began publication in the early to mid 1800s, we have it digitized back to 1841, and we can read articles about how people were talking about the formation of Brooklyn as an urban place. And we see articles there that say, where are the squares? Where are the parks? We need to have life. We need to go somewhere on the weekend with our families and sit in the shade. We need space to breathe fresh air, more fresh air than the congested streets that we have available. People were asking for it. People were building public squares. There was an incredibly beautiful public square in Lower Manhattan called Hudson Park. It was developed by Trinity Church, who controlled the land, and it was a London-based model of a semi-public space. It was a green that had a fence around it that was controlled, and only the residents around the green would have access, similar to Gramercy Park in New York, the same kind of condition that survives to this day. But this was a beautiful public space that had great architecture surrounding it. It had a chapel that was considered a really valuable monument to the city that they built. And it survived for about 40 years until the climate changed and people started moving north as Manhattan was growing. And while some people cherished the square, the owner wanted to pull out and get their money back. And, a tycoon wanted to buy the land so he could put Vanderbilt wanted to put a depot, and he literally, as soon as he bought it 2 years later, there's a massive building taking up all the public space, all this open space that was developed for this square. So we were building squares, and then we were abandoning them. And I don't think it was the popular will that they were abandoned. They were abandoned by, the powers that be that were overlooking the importance of these spaces for the public, for communities.
Yeah. Is there a general conflict, since you addressed it, you mentioned it at least, this neoliberal city? Is there an inherent conflict between, very bluntly formulated, between public space and democracy and oligarchy? Is there a difference? Is there a conflict?
I think. Yeah, I think I think the conflict starts with how you can be in that space. And then I also think it's how these spaces evolve over time and get lived in by the city residents and used by the city residents. Times Square is a kind of interesting example, again, in New York City, where, Times Square developed with the shaping, how Broadway was cutting through Manhattan, and it created these nodal points that were not so easy to build on. And so you get the kind of realization, hey, we have an open space here. And so that takes on the formalization of the name Times Square when the New York Times builds their building on the square. And of course, throughout that early phase of Manhattan's growth to, say, the 1970s, when New York, Times Square was a remarkable place, although, of course, also a notorious place. You had all sorts of levels of activity happening in that square. And by the time that American cities in general are beginning to suffer from white flight, from disinvestment, you actually see Times Square getting the use pattern of how many people wanted to live in the city or be in the city, good and bad, right? And it takes on that character. The virtue of it, at the very least, is that it was organic, right? Then in more recently, a corporate vision was brought to Times Square. Disney was certainly part of this with the idea of Broadway and the theater district. And so, Times Square is cleaned up. So certainly everyone's happy. Crime is down. Maybe some of the, nefarious activities that were happening there are eliminated. But at the same time, it becomes a sense that it's really like now a playground set up by the corporations, hosted. And literally you have the characters, walking through the streets, like to people, for tourists to take pictures with. Most New Yorkers today would probably say they avoid Times Square however they can, because it doesn't feel like a space for the city. Hudson Square, which has developed a number of blocks to the west of that and slightly south, is a case of the corporate logical conclusion of the corporate attempt to make open space in the city, which is Hudson Square. The developers given the opportunity by the city to really control the master plan, and they literally use their planning to seal off their development from the rest of the city to the east. That they make a wall that you have to only work hard to get around it to actually get into the open space that they've created. And that's the problematic space of the privately owned public square, where if you sit down on the steps to pull something, to pull out your phone to communicate with somebody, you have a private security officer come over to you and say, excuse me, you're not allowed to sit here. So certainly not a democratic space, not a space that will evolve over time in any kind of organic way. A controlled space, a space that's literally inhospitable to certain kind of activities. So the making of democratic space is I think ultimately that's part of what I'm proposing here, is that we need to ensure that there are truly public spaces developed. We cannot rely on privately owned public space to meet the need of, say, all the types of activities that should be available, from commemoration to protest. That's a democratic voice needs to occur. I know many people with the advent of social media really felt like the public square is now, on your phone, and that's how we were going to evolve. I think the evidence is that whatever the social media is providing is actually eating society up. It's certainly in the United States, it feels like that's the method by which control or manipulation or spreading nefarious information about to win an election or whatever it might be. That's not a democratic space. That is not a public square. So what choice do we have but to still have spaces where we can truly gather, where we can truly build a political culture that starts with a sense that we all have something to gain together and build social capital at the neighborhood scale. Urban neighborhoods, I live in the Upper East Side. That's the densest neighborhood in the United States. The population density is over 90,000 people per square mile. But yet there's no real public, there's a dearth of public space for people to actually be in that space. There could be incredible social capital being built all across the US in these places if, we would provide space for it to happen. It's not going to happen naturally on its own. And certainly it can happen in libraries, and it can happen in schools, and it can happen in churches and synagogues and mosques. But it also needs to happen where we can all be, coming in contact outside of all those contexts, in the context of just being in city space.
I mean, in Santa Monica, when I was there last fall, you notice that there's a lot of small city parks, or I think some of them are public, maybe some of them are private, I'm not really sure. And they sort of string through, and then you have the walking street in Santa Monica, which is in Los Angeles. And of course, you have the ocean right there also, which is another advantage. But on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night, the street restaurants were packed. There were people everywhere. The thing I noticed, there were two factors that I noticed that were very interesting, because I live in Europe now. Was number one was the expense of going out to a restaurant. Those costs, I think, sort of the frequency that somebody can go out and do those things, where it used to maybe be 2 or 3 times a week, maybe it's 1 time a week, And the other thing is there's an inherent problem in all the cities of homelessness. And, and what you notice is that the homelessness sort of is around these areas where people publicly get together or near to the parks. They don't have to be in the parks, but you notice that. And is there a way to sort of clear up that problem, those two problems, the cost, and number two, the more and more people are having problems paying their bills. And there's homeless people, and some of these people are middle class people. They're not. I mean, these are not just vagrants, if you want to. I hate to use that word, but I mean, these are all people that have problems. But I mean, you have certain people that are even business class people that lost their business, they lose their house. So how do we deal with that? You know what I mean?
Well, the first one, it seems like it's more straightforward to resolve than the second part of the question. Certainly, my argument for the public square is definitely related to the issue you raise about expense. The public square should be a place that people want to be and don't have to spend any money to be there. Like the cafe culture as the pandemic, was occurring, and the city let restaurants build sidewalk sheds and so forth. That was great. It was great to walk down the street at night and you heard the din of voices in a way you had never heard before. And it was humanizing, and that was wonderful. But yes, it was dependent on, an economic, condition operating to make that work. Part of my view of the public square is we have to make spaces that people can just sit on the steps, on the edge of the square and just watch life go by. That teenagers can gather there after school and they don't have to have any money in their pocket to be in that space. that older people who might be retired and just want to feel a connection on a beautiful sunny day can go to that square and know it's a safe space. They can just bring a newspaper and sit there and enjoy life in the city. So I do think that public space is part of the way to address that question of how do we let people be out in the city space without an economic aspect that might be hindering people's use. Homelessness for sure is a problem, a societal problem in the United States. New York is suffering from I think as bad a homeless condition right now as it's maybe ever had. I think the first thing that city space in general needs to be able to do is let us recognize each other for our common humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think, running away from homelessness, like people that say move out of the city because they don't, want to be engaged with homeless people, right? That's reasonable. And of course, many families will do that or people will do that, but it doesn't, address the core issues with homelessness. So I think society might be more, in a neighborhood, people might be more willing to understand how their tax dollars are being spent or how they could contribute to a private foundation, or they could volunteer at an event that would help, let say a homeless population recognize that their neighbors see them as people, that their neighbors, want to see the pathway for them that can provide the addressing their needs where their needs are, because people who live on the street, that as you mentioned, there are all sorts of different reasons why somebody might be on the street. Mm-hmm. People may be they might fear crime in a shelter, and that's why they're not in a shelter, for example. Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of things we need to do as a society to address people that have no homes, but we certainly are further away from it when we're demonizing them, we're dehumanizing them, and we are running away as opposed to knowing that they're in our midst. If I get on the subway on a really cold day like this past week in New York City, I know when I get on the train, there are going to be a lot of homeless people. Why are they on the train? That's the best opportunity for them to stay out of the cold and stay warm. And so the city, for example, all of these things tie together. New York City has made an effort, and I've seen it happening, to have teams of not just police officers doing crime related stuff, but actual trained people in mental health and other things that are coming into, say, the subway, and they're wearing vests and they're identifiable, and their goal is to help people where they're at and provide services or provide support, maybe get people a connection that they need to change the course of how they're living. That's what it's a little bit of the price of living in the city, but I think it's not something that we should run away from. We should be working to show generosity and show humanity and try to do what we can, whether it's just writing a check or it's, recognizing that our tax dollars are going to good use, or, volunteering in some way, whatever it might be, or carrying something in your pocket when somebody asks you for food, you can give them some food because you just happen to be carrying it on a regular basis. So homelessness is not an easy way to solve the use of public space in cities. It's not an easy thing to just snap your fingers and say it's solved. But I think what I'm always trying to point at here is just we need the baby steps of how we can be in the city space in certain ways that will, work towards maybe building not guaranteed. It's not a causal kind of situation, but can we build a society where a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie is helping us address these significant problems?
Yeah, that's a good point. Based on this, what would be your, let's say, your concluding comments? What would have to be done to revitalize the public space?
I think this, city leadership has to embrace it. We have city, I think across the United States, there's a growing sense of what cities need to do. There are definitely organizations all over the US as well as around the world that are making these confederations. Like there's the placemaking group as one example that I participated in a symposium at Pratt University in Brooklyn, or Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, that was gathering all the people that have been spending their careers dedicated to transforming places. And at that event, the new public space, I forget her title, but New York has made a new position in city government that's about the public realm, like director of the public realm. I can't remember the exact title of this position. So this very distinguished woman took on that position, and she is working to change the view and coordinate the whole citywide effort of how the public realm is treated. Why is that needed? Well, because cities very often have turned over the public realm to the Department of Transportation. And the Department of Transportation is about moving things, not letting people be in spaces. So we need to transform the way that we operate our city governments. We need city leaders at the very top. Certainly people like mayors of cities need to be very plugged into the conversation about the importance of public space. They need to see that the democracy of their city or that relates to them to the democracy of the state or to the country is really needing a provision of space where people can, begin to build relationships and build connections and build meaning and build a voice and build social capital. I think we're seeing cities move in the right direction. Certainly we have a federal government now that I think is, taking belligerent stance against that. So for example, congestion pricing is under great threat because the federal government has decided that it's not a good thing for the city of New York to pursue. So we need to really build a political voice around these issues and hold our leaders at every level, from city council people who maybe are in our community board or our community boards, our local neighborhood associations. We need to build both from the bottom up, but also then raise the issues from the highest levels of our city government to be aware that this is not something that's just like amenity. This is not something that's about like erudite people asking for these kind of things. It's really a fundamental human need, and the city is not currently providing and meeting that need. That's what we have to be working on.
Yeah, many thanks. It's an important theme, and it's a practical need for being a human being to revitalize the public space. And this is, as regards the work of our foundation, this is one of our central issues why we are also named ourselves ideal spaces, in the sense of imagined spaces, positively imagined spaces, and focusing on the public aspect of space. Many thanks for this podcast.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Ulrich. It's been a pleasure to speak with you both today.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, very much. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, this was good, and I'm very happy that you want to participate in our forthcoming symposium, because this homeless question is related to money, and housing is also related to many different things, as not only the social decline, but also the architecture of really good public spaces. For instance, if we look at social housing projects in Europe, in Vienna or Frankfurt in the 1920s, they were really good projects. So even with less money, you can build something really good.
There's a great organization in New York City called Breaking Ground, and they directly address homelessness in the city. And they often are trying to acquire either they built new buildings, but they've also acquired quite a few rundown buildings that they've converted into either transitional housing or the goal of permanent housing. And of course, they're bringing in services and support so that they're not just saying to people, good luck, here's the key. You know, they're supporting their daily life. They're giving them mental health support if that's what they need, or drug, related or other substance abuse issues. So I've actually helped run a conference in Brooklyn we called it Housing Along the Brooklyn Waterfront. And I led a panel of these really amazing organizations that were either dealing with affordable housing in their neighborhoods, and they'd been doing it since the 1970s very often, when the need was paramount. And one of them was this Breaking Ground group. But definitely I have a lot I could share from that at the symposium. It'd be great to join.
It could be very good. It is practical, and it's improving the life situation in a practical way. It can be done, improving
yes, exactly.
life. It is not to remain an unreachable utopia.
Exactly.
This is very often the counter argument. Yeah, this would be nice, but we cannot make it due to. And then 100 hindering frame conditions are listed up why we cannot improve our life.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Many thanks, Jason.
All right. Thank you. Both of you gentlemen. Great afternoon or evening for you.
Have a good afternoon, Jason.
You have a good afternoon.